I've created almost 100 science videos for the classroom. The videos cover every next generation science standard for biology and earth science, including astronomy. Show them in the classroom, assign them to your students who are absent, use them as supplemental materials, or use them to learn yourself. You can pick individual videos for as little as $1 or save 10 to 20% by getting a bundle. Search Planet Peterson on Teachers Pay Teachers or click the link in the description.
Was Jesus a failed apocalyptic prophet? You did a response that I thought it was really, really good.
All right, let's see it.
So the basic argument is Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. And
Right.
people go to those verses where Jesus says, some standing here will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming with the kingdom.
Some people believe he is saying that the disciples here will
Yeah.
not die until I come back for the second time.
Yeah, people go, well, Jesus predicted that that generation, the people he was talking to, are going to see the second coming.
Of the text, and I would argue that it is the consensus view that the Olivet Discourse represents Jesus' second coming as anticipated within a single generation. And I would also argue that folks who offer alternative interpretations are motivated primarily by dogmatism, and specifically by the need to sidestep the plain sense of a text that would otherwise seem to undermine the inspiration, the inerrancy, the univocality of the Bible.
And so you go, what do you do?
So if we look at Mark here, this is where it says generation. Truly I tell you, this generation shall not pass until these things have happened. And up here is where they go over everything. What's really funny, I was reading this before I started the stream, and it says there will be earthquakes in various places and famines, and they'll go over this later, but you'll get dragged out and it'll get preached to nations and things like that. I've never heard anybody comment this. It would be interesting. In Matthew's, I think that's the only gospel where when Jesus dies, there's the earthquake, right? So I wonder if Matthew, the main consensus view is Mark came first, and Matthew used Mark to write part of his gospel. But I wonder if Matthew put that earthquake in there because it's in Mark, and it's one of the things that Jesus says will happen as we're leading up to the second coming and all that.
Do with this? Well, some scholars have said, well, let's take a step back here. Are we even understanding prophecy right?
So this is just the first hermeneutic step in trying to find an alternative to the plain sense of the text, because you cannot accept the plain sense of the text.
So we tend to think of prophecy like fatalism. If God says this is going to happen, it's fated to occur. Nothing we can do can change that.
There is no one way that prophecy works throughout the Bible. It works according to the rhetorical goals of whatever authors are coming up with stories related to prophecy. And fatalism is probably the majority approach to prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, and there are some explicit declarations of that. For instance, Numbers 23:19, where the text says, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a mortal that he should change his mind. Has he promised, and will he not do it? Has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? On the other hand, we have explicit declarations of God changing their mind after unconditional prophecies, such as in the book of Jonah, where Jonah is said to tell Nineveh that 40 days and the city will be overthrown, and then it explicitly says that God changed their mind after the king told his people that they should all repent and hope that God changes their mind. And then we also have claims that God deceives through their prophets. In Jeremiah 4, for instance, Jeremiah says that God has deceived the people by saying there will be peace in the land. In 1 Kings 22, Micaiah tells the king that God has sent a lying spirit to deceive him to his very death. And there are other times when false prophecy is said to be just the work of the prophets themselves. So there are a variety of different ways that prophecy works according to the rhetorical goals of the author. And the notion that anyone can assert a single way that prophecy works across the whole Bible is simply imposing a unifying framework on the text in order to serve the rhetorical goals of whoever is interpreting it.
That's not...
So, Dan is he's way smarter than me, obviously. But the main problem we have here is that, Jesus says this generation will not pass. There are all these things that are said will happen, but ultimately this generation will not pass until all these things have happened. So, like, you can make the claim that some prophecies are conditional, some are not. And if you're committed to believing, what I understand Dan is trying to say in more plain speak is, if you're committed to believing in the univocality and the truthness of the scriptures and the gospels, that what they say can't be wrong, then what you have to do is search for a way that this can be true in spite of the plain reading of the text. And so that's essentially what is going
Really
on
how
here.
prophecy works in the Bible. A good prophet sometimes is a prophet who doesn't see his prophecy come to pass. Because prophecy in the Old Testament specifically is conditional.
Sometimes
I would, you know what? I would pay both of them $1,000 to like come on my platform and actually have a debate. I would gladly do it.
Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Again, the text is not univocal. Prophecy functions according to the rhetorical goals of the authors telling the stories related to prophecy.
Everyone needs to read Jeremiah 18. God tells Jeremiah, look, if I send a prophecy and the people repent, I'll relent of the disaster. If I speak good and they turn to evil, I'll relent of the good thing I plan to do.
So, two things to note here. First,
Before we go into that, Jeremiah, that is what it says. I looked up a couple of different translations. This is the New King James Version, sorry. But the instant I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to pluck up, to pull down, and to destroy it, if that nation against whom I have spoken turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I thought to bring upon it. And the instant I speak concerning a nation and concerning a kingdom, to plan to and to build and to plant it, if it does evil in my sight, then I will relent concerning the good which I said would benefit it. There, I can't read this morning.
First, Jeremiah's prophecies are being represented as conditional because that serves Jeremiah's rhetorical goals, which are related to trying to get the people of Judah to repent. This is not a governing framework that can be imposed upon any and all prophecies to just arbitrarily render them conditional whenever they don't seem to be coming to pass. Second thing, the translation here is awful. The text absolutely does not say, I will relent of the disaster. The text says, I will change my mind regarding the disaster. It uses the nephal stem of the verb nacham, which in the nephal means to regret, to feel bad, to change one's mind. And then the preposition al means regarding. So this very clearly says...
So this is where it gets extremely tricky, and it's hard for normal people like me. Like, if I would have just seen what Inspiring Philosophy posted, I'd be like, okay. I mean, I take your word for it. And I could even go to the Bible and I could see that that's exactly what it says. But
I will change my mind.
Sorry, it does that every time. But Dan can read the Hebrew and the Greek, and he can tell you no, because of the way it's modified with, I don't know grammatical terms, but the way in which the word choice is used and how it specifically modifies the subject or whatever, we know that what it actually means is changing your mind. It's not as simple as the translations that have been passed down to us. And that's why this stuff is just so... I don't respond, or I don't like make stitches or respond when people give these, like what Inspiring Philosophy is doing. I would never do that because there's just too much expertise that you have to attack it. The text is very complex. It's very long. There are lots of interconnections, and you have to speak multiple languages and be a historian to be able to know if what you're being told isn't the full story. And very few of us are that.
Regarding the disaster, avoiding again the plain sense of the text precisely to serve the dogmatic presuppositions of inerrancy, of inspiration, of univocality.
God is very clear. Prophecies can be changed or delayed based on what humans decide to do. God set up prophecy the eschaton, prophetic fulfillments, on man's response.
Some authors do, some authors do not. The presupposition that absolutely all eschatological prophecies are conditional and contingent upon the response of humans is not supported by any data. It is something that is only asserted because it serves the rhetorical goals of sidestepping the plain sense of certain texts.
So in Mark 13, he says the gospel has to be...
One of Dan's most consistent critiques that he gets is you have to look at the plain, or I don't know, people will say he flip-flops from you're betraying the plain sense of the text and then, well, we have to understand the context of it. And again, if you're on one side or the other, well, if you're on the opposite side of Dan or whatever, that sounds completely valid. And he does switch back and forth between those two things, but that kind of like you're just assuming that Dan is trying to like peddle a narrative. And I mean, I guess he is, but the narrative he's trying to peddle is this is what the data indicates. So if he's saying the plain text, he's already assuming like no, I understand the language, I understand the time and place, I understand what the author is talking about. So that stuff is just front loaded and people just hear him say one thing and then they're like, aha, he's switching his argument to, I don't know, for his rhetorical goal. That's one of his favorite things to say.
Preached first to all nations. Has the gospel 2,000 years later been preached to every nation? No.
So this is once again ignoring the rhetorical goals of the authors. Here, the author of the Gospel of Mark is representing the proclamation of the gospel to all nations within the context of this persecution that would see Jesus's followers being beaten in synagogues and being dragged before judges and magistrates and kings, where they would proclaim the gospel as Paul did, thereby fulfilling the proclamation of the gospel to all nations as the author of the Gospel of Mark understood them. That was something that was understood to be inevitable and imminent in light of the persecution that Jesus' followers were experiencing. It was not something that was going to take thousands of years. We have to take the author at their word according to their understanding of the text. Otherwise, we are just presupposing that this is true prophecy that does not originate with the author but from God, and that is just begging the question.
So there he kind of said it. He said we have to understand the plain reading of the text according to the author's goals. So there's context embedded in that. It's not just literally read what it says and don't take into account that it could possibly be metaphorical or anything like that.
Matthew 23, Jesus says, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Okay, Jesus will not return until Israel accepts he's the Messiah.
Matthew 23 is not part of the Olivet Discourse, which precedes the entire Gospel of Matthew, but at the same time, the author of Matthew expected that conversion to take place imminently.
What does Paul say in Romans 11? This has been delayed until the fullness of Gentiles is coming. Then all of Israel will be saved.
So Romans 11:25 says absolutely nothing about delay. But additionally, Paul was expecting all of these things to happen imminently in his day. And the note
I pulled up Romans here, 11:23, right? That's what they said. Oh no, what is it?
that this was a expected that conversion to take place, and that is just a word according to opposing with
Jesus me again, blessed until Israel accepts he's the Messiah.
Matthew 23 is not part of the Olivet Discourse, which precedes the entire Gospel of Matthew, but at the same time, the author of Matthew expected that conversion to take place imminently.
What does Paul say in Romans 11? This has been delayed until the fullness of Gentiles is coming. Then all of Israel will be saved.
So Romans 11:25.
25, okay. I could have just kept reading. But, am I in the right place? Romans 11:25. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles has come in, and this way Israel will be saved. So that's just really, again, I read this and that's, I don't know, a little bit difficult to understand because it's really wonky. But it kind of, when it says the full number of Gentiles has come in, is it saying that literally every single Gentile on the planet needs to be converted, or what does it mean? I mean, the vagueness lets you assert that it could mean whatever you need it to mean, I guess. And then Dan's thing there is, well, no, Paul also thought that this would all, that Jesus would come during his lifetime. I've heard tons and tons of scholars say the same thing, that was Paul's perspective. So Paul is given that fact about Paul. Paul's not saying, no, thousands of years from now or whenever this will happen. Am I doing a reaction video to a reaction video? Yes, and we're actually doing a couple of them. So I'll be reacting to reaction videos, reacting to reactions of reaction videos at some point.
Says absolutely nothing about delay. But additionally, Paul was expecting all of these things to happen imminently in his day. And the notion that this was a contingent prophecy that is still awaiting all the conditions to be met so that it can be fulfilled begs the question, because it presupposes that the prophecy comes from an inspired divine source, rather than from the socially and historically limited and contingent perspective of the human author Paul.
Therefore, in line with the conditional prophecy we see in places like Daniel, Jeremiah, Jonah, Amos, we should expect a delay until those stipulations are fulfilled. So it's not that Jesus made a false prediction. He made a prediction in that cultural context that is conditional prophecy. You can make these overstatements like it's going to happen quickly, it's going to happen now, but they already understood it will be delayed if the stipulations are not fulfilled.
So this entire argument...
So yeah, that's really silly. He's just asserting that, well, that's not what it says, but the people in that time and in that place and in that context knew that that's what the author meant. And then he appeals to like Old Testament books that were written it's many, many, many centuries earlier, as if that's the same context. I mean, it's the same geographical area roughly, but I find that to be pretty weak.
Argument requires one presuppose that the conditions that were placed on the prophecy, which were also off in the author's future, were inspired and prophetic and of divine origin. Because if they're not, then they're just additional parts of the prophecy that had a time limit imposed upon them. Because if you look in the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13, Jesus says, first X must happen, then Y will happen, then Z will happen, and this generation will not pass away until all these things have come to pass. So the conditions are wrapped up in the time limit placed on the prophecy. And to say, no, the conditions are not a part of that prophecy, the conditions are still pending, therefore the prophecy is still pending, requires you presuppose that those conditions were inspired. The data don't support that. The text quite clearly indicates that all of these things were expected by the author to take place imminently, and they did not. And the fit for this video has been bizarro.
Yeah, I don't actually care about your shirts that much, Dan. I'm sorry. What's really funny,
that need to be met.
If you go to Inspiring Philosophy's videos on this,
All right.
it's just so you know, it's the data over dogma, right? That's the Dan McClellan, that's his motto, that's his crowd or whatever. And it's just so funny every time he stitches somebody else, a theist, like whether it's Brooks or IP or whatever, all you get is people saying shit like this. Like they couldn't more perfectly encapsulate what he's like. They couldn't more perfectly how do I want to say it? Make his point for him, I guess, because no argument, just Dan McClellan is Satan's greatest warrior, and that is the, I don't want to say consensus view, as if likes on a TikTok video is actually representative, but it's about as good as you can get, and that is the most popular opinion. That's a Dan acolyte going in there talking to him, but my favorite part is that I'm waiting patiently for Dan's sources and scholars, and we get nothing. I love that part. So yeah, IP has this tactic of like putting up quotes and pages from books, and I'll show you how he did that with me later on. But No, like the idea that Dan, a professional scholar, doesn't inform his opinions from scholarship. You can't do anything with these people. And everything IP produces, people slurp it up because they don't really do any thinking. It's pretty obvious. Dan is a Mormon. Yes, yeah. No questions. All right. So again, IP responded to that, but instead of watching all of their videos, we're just going to watch the Dan ones. And if that makes me biased, so be it. And I have noticed that the audio is really quiet when they input a stitch. I can't make it louder. Sorry, guys.
Let's see it.
Yeah, let's see it.
All right, let's see it.
Okay, sorry. I have to go back because you guys got to see
let's
this.
see it.
Yeah, let's see it.
So this do you guys know about this emoji? This is this is a TikTok emoji specifically, and people use it all the time when they try to like mock somebody for trying to be all like, yeah, I know, stuff like that. As soon as I heard him do that, as soon as I heard IP do that, that's all I could think of. Like, he's the living embodiment of that emoji.
Represents Jesus' second coming as anticipated within a single generation. And I would also argue that folks who offer alternative interpretations are motivated primarily by dogmatism, and specifically by the need to sidestep the plain sense of a text.
So this is just blatant poisoning of the well. It has no bearing on the actual arguments that scholars have put forward.
To call that poisoning of the well is so incredibly silly. I don't know. It gets addressed later on too, but poisoning the well is when you say something like, well, my opponent, it's kind of like you do an ad hom in advance of giving your argument to make people to sort of delegitimize everything they're going to say. So you poison the well so that every time they say something, you doubt it, or you think their motivations are incorrect or something like that. And to claim that he's poisoning the well by saying that is he gets away with throwing out these just flippant accusations of fallacies because he knows his audience will just simply agree with him no matter what. There's no need to be. He's not going to be held accountable by his audience. Actually, one of you in the chat said it. IP is only playing to the crowd, his crowd. So perfectly said. Who was that? Top Tester.
Or that Jesus was giving a conditional prophecy.
So my 2 points are not poisoning the well in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. They actually come explicitly from the one book where you got this idea that you just showed on the screen. For instance, if we go to page 23, we see Chris Hayes stating, having maneuvered through the exegetical intricacies of Jesus' scholarship, we concluded that Jesus did indeed prophesy his second coming and the consummation of the kingdom of God sometime within a generation of his preaching. And this is represented then as a problem. Here's page 18, the final sentence of the first paragraph on the page. As Christian theologians, however, we appreciate that this critical research creates some serious dogmatic problems. And then the next section is entitled The Theological Problems with a Failed Apocalyptic Prophet. Acknowledging that Jesus' prophecy did not get fulfilled the way it was articulated does not create problems outside of dogmatism. It does not create logical problems. It does not create factual problems. It does not create historical problems unless you dogmatically believe that this cannot be. And that whole section explains that. And there's the rest of the section.
So yeah, perfectly said. And it's so funny when people this reminds me of I don't know how many of you saw the debate that it was Blitz, myself, and that other guy who said, oh, this book that this guy wrote completely like revolutionized physics, but people just ignored it because they're gatekeeping knowledge. And then Blitz downloaded the book, did a Control F for the equals sign, and it came up with 0 of 0. It was like, there aren't even any equations in this book. So to state that this book revolutionizes quantum physics or something is just so stupid. And I feel like a similar type of own goal is going on here. So satisfying.
Talking about how much of a problem this is for Christians, for dogmatism, for theology. And then we can go into the volume outline. In the following chapters, we propose to explain that even though Schweitzer, Allison, and Ehrman are essentially correct, that Jesus prophesied the consummation of the kingdom of God, judgment, resurrection, punishment, and reward, to occur within striking distance of his earthly ministry, certainly within several decades, this should not be thought to undercut Christian hope. On the contrary, it is our thesis that the delay of the parousia is entirely consonant with the way ancient prophecy works and with the operations of the God that Christians worship. So again, we have a dogmatic, a confessional, a theological solution to a dogmatic, a confessional, a theological problem. And then here, further down, however unspecified Jesus was about days, hours, and minutes, he did broadly, i.e. generationally, delimit the time of his return in glory to consummate the kingdom and judge the world. But that eschatological consummation is now way overdue. We are way past appealing to fuzzy scheduling. It's time to grasp the nettle. How do we explain the fact that Jesus did not return in glory within the time frame he prophesied?
So that's the most important thing there. How do we explain that what was written did not come to pass? And you can come up with excuses for how to do that, but what you're doing is you're allowing the text and the data you have to be workable with the conclusion that you've already brought, which is the dogmatic position. And dogma, it's supposed to be a loaded term. It's like when you call somebody ignorant, what people think you're doing is calling them stupid. You're not. I'm just saying, look, you're just ignorant about something you just don't know. And I mean, it's used pejoratively, but that's not necessarily what you're trying to do when you say that. And to say that the dogmatic approach or the dogmatic argument is given and it is dogmatic in spite of what the text says is not an ad hom. It's not poisoning the well or anything like that. It's just the reality as the authors have basically conceded to.
The answer is simple. It was a prophecy, and prophecies are conditional. So the way to sidestep the plain sense of the text, as these scholars acknowledge, is the accurate reading of the text, is by arguing that this is a conditional prophecy. My two statements were 100% correct, as your own single only source demonstrates. So the only question is this notion of conditional prophecy baked into the Olivet Discourse, or is this something that we are imposing upon it from the outside in order to solve this problem? That's the real question here. You are just trying to use accusations of fallacy to rhetorically deflect and evade, but your own source agrees with me. Fatalism is probably...
You know, that Dan will insult you in the kindest way like that. I mean, it wasn't really kind, but his insults are like, they're academic insults. They're like nerd insults. It reminds me of that time. There's this really famous, I can't remember who the hell said it, but there's this physicist, and he was given like a paper that somebody wrote for their like master's thesis, and they asked this physicist, I think it was Linus, or not Linus, Pauli. I think it was Pauli, but they gave it to him and he asked him what his opinion on it was. And he said, it's not even wrong, which was his way of saying it's so nonsensical that I can't even say that it's wrong. Like 2 + 2 = banana. That's not false in so much as it literally makes absolutely no sense.
The majority approach to prophecy in the Hebrew Bible. And
so it doesn't seem like it's the majority approach in the Hebrew Bible. As C.A. Strine observes, we have more evidence of conditional prophecy than fatalistic.
So the quote you showed on the screen does not say what you said Strine observed. And I searched for your quote throughout the book, and I could not find it in whole or in any of its parts. So it seems that Strine did not say that. The closest I could find from Strine is this statement on page 47. Since the evidence that de Jong and Tiemeyer compile stretches across time and place in the ancient Near East, one might come to regard the so-called minority hermeneutic of Jeremiah 18 as the ancient norm and Deuteronomy 18 as the anomalous text. So the closest you get is Strine acknowledging that other scholars have arrived at that conclusion. But Strine doesn't really assert it. Strine just says one might come to that conclusion. But Strine himself is the one who imposed this categorization of the minority hermeneutic represented by conditionality in Jeremiah 18 and the majority hermeneutic represented by the way Deuteronomy and other texts represent prophecy. So I would argue that your claim is not quite substantiated, and you're going to go on to say that it is conditional anytime there's no explicit declaration that this cannot be revoked or that this is definitely going to happen. So you seem to be assuming conditionality in a lot more places than is merited.
Now, some prophecies.
You know, this all reminds me of? This reminds me of when God said, if you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, on this day you will die or whatever. And then they turn around and say that it was a spiritual death. And it's like obvious that that's what it meant or whatever. It's like, no, he said it, something else happened, and now you're just reinterpreting what he said. And people have written entire books, hundreds of pages, thousands of pages, to try to explain this one sentence, and they try to pull another thing, and it's like, no, it's just wrong. Or God just lied, I guess, basically. Or even if he did the thing where it's like a parent says, I'll kill you if you touch my azaleas or something. Like, okay, well, they didn't literally mean kill. It's like, okay, well, that betrays the nature of God as we're told as well, because it's basically a lie anyways, even if it's hyperbolic, but whatever.
Are fatalistic, and in this unscripted interview I just simply forgot to mention it. But when that happens, the authors seem to tell us that it's fixed, like in Genesis 41 for
one day a million years.
The same
yeah
is true for the prophecy in Numbers 23. We're specifically told it could not be revoked. When something like that isn't stated, the assumption in the cultural background seems to be that the prophecies that are given are more often conditional.
So absolutely no such thing seems to be the case anytime there is a prophecy without the explicit rhetorical flourish that this cannot be revoked. Nothing in the text indicates that. What you are arguing is that nothing prevents me from reading this into any prophecy where they don't add the explicit rhetorical flourish that this is irrevocable. But again, this comes back to the main question. Is that conditionality baked into the text, or is this something that we are imposing upon the text in order to resolve a dogmatic problem? Quite clearly, it's the latter.
Yes, the God of the Bible has lied more than once. Yeah, my favorite one is the mustard seed one. All right, we're moving on to part 2.
There's nothing in the book of Jonah which says the initial prophecy that God gave was unconditional. In fact, as C.A. Strine notes, the whole point of the story in Jonah fleeing was that he understood the prophecy was conditional, and if he did go to Nineveh and preach, they could repent, and therefore God would relent of the disaster, which occurred at the end.
So there are 2 reasons that we know the prophecy in Jonah was unconditional. 1, no conditions were stated, so it's unconditional. 2, the text in Jonah 3:10 explicitly says that God changed his mind regarding the evil he threatened to do to them, and he didn't do it. In a conditional prophecy, you don't change your mind. You say, I'm going to do X unless you do Y. And then if they fulfill the conditions, then you are still doing precisely what you said you would do. But when you change your mind, that means there were no conditions. You just changed your mind. And that.
So Jonah is, I didn't know this, but Jonah is incredibly short. It's only 4 chapters, and you can, like, that's Jonah 1. Jonah 2 is just that right there. Jonah 3 is even shorter. And Jonah 4, and that's it. So a lot of this is going to rest on, it's going to take me a second to find it. So anyway, well, the background is God tells Jonah, go to Nineveh and because they're wicked and tell them I'm going to destroy them. It doesn't say go tell them that they have an opportunity to redeem themselves. It doesn't say anything like that. And Jonah ran away. And then, okay, here's where I have to do a little bit of searching. Okay, my brain is not braining,
That's
so
explicitly what the text says. And that makes absolutely clear this was not a conditional prophecy. God changed their mind. So, two things to note here. First, Jeremiah's prophecies are being represented as conditional because that serves Jeremiah's rhetorical goals, which are related to trying to get the people of Judah to repent.
This is just an ad hominem fallacy. Jeremiah's
ad
rhetorical
hominem
goals have no bearing on whether or not what he said is true about prophecy.
So, one, there's absolutely no sense whatsoever in which it is ad hominem to acknowledge the rhetorical goals and that they ought to influence how we understand what the texts are saying. Second thing, whether or not this is true about prophecy is not a question that can be answered because the notion of prophecy is a dogma. It is not open to scrutiny. One either accepts it or does not accept it. And so you can't even pretend to demonstrate that this is true about prophecy. You can only decide that it must be true about prophecy. And if you're going to insist that this discussion take place on a dogmatic level and then accuse me of poisoning the well by suggesting this whole thing is about dogmatism, then we are at a significant impasse. The presupposition
see, that's just his way of insulting you, like academically, in a really fun way. But yeah, an ad hominem fallacy. I just couldn't.
All eschatological prophecies are conditional and contingent upon the response of humans, is not supported by any data. It is something that is only asserted because it serves the rhetorical goals of sidestepping the plain sense of certain texts.
So this is just more poisoning of the well. Arguments need to be judged on their own merit, not by the motives of who is making them.
No, it's not poisoning the well. It's directly engaging the argument on its merits. The argument can provide no data that demonstrate that all prophecies are conditional unless they explicitly say this cannot be revoked or this is definitely going to happen. Nobody has provided any data regarding that. And I'm pointing out that when we look at those different ways that different authors represent prophecy, their rhetorical goals, what they're hoping their text will achieve, should influence how we interpret those things. What you're suggesting is that you have the prerogative to take one author's representation of their prophecy as conditional and impose it upon all other prophecies and say, unless they explicitly say this cannot be revoked, then their prophecies are conditional. And you're doing it precisely to resolve a dogmatic problem. You're doing precisely what I said you're doing, and
It's kind of weird that we're not talking about Mark anymore. Right. So we're so fixated on trying to make a justification for what Mark was saying, for what Jesus is saying on the Mount of Olives, the Olivet Discord, that we're looking at all these other places in the Old Testament and saying this is what's going on. And then the whole rest of this just turns into the book of Jonah in the end. It's kind of funny how it got derailed.
You're trying to engage in this rhetorical prophylaxis of using false accusations of fallacy to rhetorically deflect attention away from the fact that you have not made your case. You have just presupposed it and then are accusing me of ad hominem and poisoning the well for pointing out that you're just presupposing your argument. So this is once again ignoring the rhetorical goals of the authors.
Because once again, the rhetorical goals of the author has no bearing on whether or not the statement is true or false. This is fallacious reasoning.
First, we have to
he's going to say it, but the intentions of the authors have no bearing on whether or not it's true or false. It does if we're talking about prophecy, because if the author said that this prophecy is going to happen in this amount of time, then it absolutely does. I mean, it completely matters. It's like the only thing that matters.
understand what the statement is before we can determine whether it's true or false. And we do have to understand the rhetorical goals of the author in order to adequately interpret what the statement means. This is basic hermeneutics, where they would proclaim
There's that academic insult.
as Paul did, thereby fulfilling the proclamation of the gospel to all nations as the author of the Gospel of Mark understood.
Oh, we're back to Mark.
Mark doesn't state that Jesus' statement only referred to the nations that the apostles preached to. The plain reading of the text is that the gospel must be proclaimed to all nations, not some.
So you misrepresent me. I'm not saying some. I am literally saying all. I am suggesting the author of the Gospel of Mark expected the gospel to be proclaimed to all nations within that single generation as a result of the disciples being dragged before magistrates and kings. And I'm not making this up. I would suggest that this is the consensus reading of this passage. For instance, from the Hermeneia Commentary series, here's Adela Collins' comment on this verse. The point seems to be that during the period of political, social, and economic upheaval, the task of the followers of Jesus is to be the proclamation of the good news to all the nations, and that the occasion for this will be official interrogation by Jewish and various Gentile authorities. Only after this task is accomplished will the divine intervention occur, and only those who do not succumb to the opposition involved will experience the intervention as blessing. It would appear then that the events predicted in verses 9 through 13 also belong to the period characterized as the beginning of the birth pains. And she's going to go on to say that the prediction that all this would happen within this single generation includes everything from verse 5 on. And as I pointed out earlier, and as your book agrees, this is the consensus reading of this passage. We have to take the author at their word according to their understanding of the text.
Mark never provided a timeline of how long it would take to preach to all nations.
On the
Yes, he did. It says, "This generation shall not pass."
contrary, Mark includes the proclamation of the gospel to all nations within the things that will all take place within that single generation. That's verse 30 where he says that. And verses 5 through 30 are a single response to the disciples' question in verse 4, tell us when these things shall happen and what shall be the sign that they are being fulfilled. This is the consensus view of critical scholars. Otherwise, we're just presupposing that this is true prophecy that does not originate with the author but from God, and that is just begging the question.
No, it isn't, because the argument I'm addressing in that clip you're responding to is presented to us as an internal critique. In other words, someone comes to us and says, if Christianity is true, how do you explain Jesus' prophecies in the Olivet Discourse? And so the critic is granting that the prophecy did come from God in order to show that Christianity is not internally consistent. And so our response must operate within those parameters.
So I was just responding to that clip as I found it. I did not go check out the full interview to try to understand all of the background. So if I have misunderstood your argument, then I apologize. That's on me for not doing my due diligence and going and trying to understand the full context of your response. But this does raise a question for me, because you objected to my observation that alternative explanations seem to arise from a dogmatic need to sidestep the plain reading of the text. And I've already shown that the Hayes book explicitly acknowledges that that's what they're doing. You seem to think that that was poisoning the well to say that. So I would like clarification. Are you saying that your argument only works provided everyone involved already accepts a list of Christian dogmas? If that's the case, then your argument can't function within a critical environment. It can only function within a dogmatic environment. If you're making the case that this is a de jure argument that requires presupposing a list of Christian dogmas, please say so. And I will apologize and I will back out of this argument and I will be happy to be wrong. If that's not what you're saying, please say so and I will continue my response.
Dan McClellan responded to my video, but before I get to that question he asked of me at the end,
Hey, look, there's me.
I'm going to go through his two-part response and respond to various points.
All right, let's see it.
So you absolutely did poison the well, regardless of what the authors of the book said. Because poisoning of the well occurs when we illegitimately prime our audience with a
So he's doing actually, he's doing, how do you spell that? Actually, he's doing this. This is him right now. Actually, so
preemptive strike against, or with adverse information about, an argumentative opponent before the latter has had a chance to say anything in her own defense or in defense of her point of view.
if that's how poisoning the well works, then like basically every single debate, maybe not every single, but that would be part and parcel for most of the debates I've ever seen, because when people give their opening statement, they'll say, well, my opponent, like if you're going to do a young earth creationist debate or whatever, like, well, my opponent takes a literalist approach or whatever, or my opponent disregards what science tells us about what that just matter-of-factly is the case.
Just because they acknowledge their biases in the book and acknowledge this creates dogmatic problems, still has no bearing on the truth of their argument.
One, it absolutely is not in any way, shape, or form whatsoever poisoning the well to share a thesis statement, even if the thesis statement is critical. I literally said I would argue X and Y, and then I argued X and Y, and demonstrated both X and Y from your own source. You think it is a fallacy because you seem to think that it is ad hominem to address dogmatic motivations. You repeatedly claim throughout these responses that there's something inappropriate with me talking about motivations, but that addresses the rest of this clip. First, no, they're not just sharing their biases, they're sharing their motivations and their methodologies, both of which are firmly grounded in dogmatic concerns. Without the dogmatic problem of Jesus' prophecy not coming true, this book doesn't exist. So a primary motivation for this book is that dogmatism, and there are theological dogmas wrapped up in the methodologies that they explain. They explicitly acknowledge that. So the reason that's relevant, despite your claim that it's not, is because it means that the argument of the book is only going to convince people who already agree with that set of dogmas, meaning outside of the presupposition of those dogmas, the argument doesn't work. And that's my whole point.
I've never seen Dan not wear a graphic t-shirt. Not a criticism, just an observation.
You even accused me of engaging in ad hominem because I said we need to consider the rhetorical goals of the author in Jeremiah in interpreting what Jeremiah is saying. And I noticed you were more than happy to not even acknowledge, much less respond to my criticisms of that particular flailing about with a logical fallacy accusation to avoid having to engage actual critical scholarship and concern with the dogmatism underlying your apologetic defenses.
We have more evidence of conditional prophecy than fatalistic.
So the quote you showed on the screen does not say what you said Strine observed. And I searched for your quote throughout the book, and I could not find it in whole or in any of its parts.
Which is very odd that you missed it, because I put on the screen, it's on page 57. Here's a screenshot. You can see the full quote.
So I'm just baffled at how you an actual response to my argument. You claim that Strine argued we have more evidence for conditional prophecy than for fatalistic. Strine argued absolutely no such thing. No such quote appears anywhere in the book. No such sentiment is ever asserted by Strine. It is entirely unrelated to your original quote, and even when you said, no, dummy, you got to look at page 57, here's the quote, that's also entirely unrelated to the claim that we have more evidence for conditional prophecy than fatalistic. I shared the closest we get to that sentiment anywhere in the entire book, and it is Strine pointing to de Jong and Thiemeyer and saying, based on their evidence, one might come to regard conditional prophecy as the norm and fatalistic prophecy as the anomaly. But Strine never arrives at that conclusion. In the footnote, Strine says that's the conclusion they arrived at. Strine never arrives at that conclusion. So, again, your claim remains not demonstrated.
Okay, I gotta show you guys what happened when he and I stitched these videos. So this is on my channel. You can watch the whole thing. We're not going to go through the whole thing. But he created this video where he said,
humanity, given that Christianity is responsible for so much of our moral progress, as well as increasing education and literacy rates, spreading democratic values, and was crucial for ending slavery.
So I just basically make the argument that this is cherry picking because the people that have been on the opposite side, that have opposed those gains we've made historically in the West, have always been Christians. But I don't blame Christians for it. I say it's really neither exactly one nor the other. We have inexorably marched towards a state of more wealth, better health, longer lives, less ignorance, more rights, more autonomy, and less autocracy. That has coincided directly with a world and worldviews that have become more and more secular.
The double standard you keep applying is unbelievable. If secularism exists alongside good outcomes, there's somehow a meaningful connection there. But if Christianity has been shown to lead to positive outcomes in multivariate analyses, there's no meaningful connection.
Okay, this right here, this is the key thing. So I am going to have to actually address what he said there in an earlier part. But so he brings up all these papers to scientifically prove that there's all these correlations with positive social benefits and whatever with Christianity. Well, watch what happens. No, I said the less religious they are. I never claimed secularism did anything. That's a stupid point to make. And if you think I'm that stupid, then okay. But you didn't even remotely understand what I was saying. By the way, what I was talking about were things like the fact that global human prosperity, the rate of violent death, and democracy have trended positively. And he countered with papers correlating religion with the big five personality traits, drug addiction, the grades kids get at Christian high schools. How much more irrelevant could you have gotten? So, yeah, he, in talking about the world becoming a better place, his counter evidence is the GPA of kids that go to private Christian schools. And he does that because he preaches to the lowest common denominator to his audience, and he knows that they won't look into this stuff. So he puts this stuff up and it's flashy and it makes him look like he dunked on me or whatever, but it didn't do anything like that. So he goes in here and he says like, I have this double standard because
books I cited, they blatantly state that. Again, I never comes there's somehow a meaningful connection there, but if Christianity has been shown to lead to good outcomes, there's somehow a
Yeah, so what he did was at some point he left this comment where he said that but now you're committing an attribute error and still ignoring what the experts say. You need to show that their bad actions came from theology, not just merely assume it. So he's like, I bring up things like the slave trade or like how conquistadors in the New World killed huge numbers of people. And he said, you're making a correlation versus causation fallacy because you haven't proven that it had anything to do with their religious beliefs. You know what? I'll just play this. So this is what I stitched. Just assume it. Meanwhile, you, Bazile, who is Roman Catholic, criminalized interracial marriage in the United States, arguing that God created races as proof that he did not intend for them to mix. Does that sound theologically motivated? Does the Bible say explicitly that Noah cursed Ham's descendants to be slaves forever? Yes. Did Christians push the narrative of the curse of Ham to justify slavery? Yes. Does that sound like it's theologically motivated? And it doesn't matter if you think their interpretation of it is wrong. They are Christians. That was their theological interpretation. You don't get to claim that nobody is truly a Scotsman. Or how about Richard Pratt and his doctrine of kill the Indian, save the man, whereby there was a systematic effort to extinguish Native American culture and replace it with a new culture. Quote, "We have not yet fully completed our work, nor will we have done so until there is throughout all our communities the most unequivocal and complete acceptance of our own doctrines, both national and religious. Not until there shall be in every locality throughout the nation a supremacy of the Bible principle of the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God." Sounds theologically motivated, doesn't it? Oh my God, I just realized I'm wearing the same shirt. I'm wearing the same shirt now that I am in this video. That's funny. This is actually like one of my favorite shirts. I also read some... Oh, wait, no, that's a different shirt. That's my California shirt. That's my California Bear shirt. Okay, I'm an idiot and I'm blind. My bad. But I also, in here, I read some firsthand accounts from Pizarro's men saying how they're going to slay all the heathens because they are not Christians and so on and so forth. And then he just completely ignored that. And he actually, at one point, he claimed Herder, I put all these books up on my screen, and you, Planet Peterson, you didn't reference any studies or anything in your claims. Meanwhile, I had just read a bunch of first-hand accounts, and I know he saw the video because he left a comment saying, oh, I'm going to have fun with this. So, yeah, just total dishonesty.
Nothing in the text indicates that. What you are arguing is that nothing prevents me from reading this into any prophecy where they don't add the explicit rhetorical flourish that this is irrevocable.
And I could just say you're doing the same thing in reverse. You're just assuming unconditional prophecy unless it specifically mentions that the prophecy is conditional.
So this is a pretty
you're you're just assuming that if it says it's not the type of that type of thing, then it's not that type of thing. Okay, little bro.
textbook burden of proof fallacy. It's not my responsibility to demonstrate that prophecies that lack conditions cannot possibly be conditional prophecies. This is your argument. You brought it. It is your responsibility to demonstrate your argument, which is that these prophecies that lack conditions are actually conditional prophecies. So you've got to demonstrate that that is the most likely conclusion. And all I'm pointing out is that you have not yet demonstrated that. The argument to this point has basically been that because some prophecies are conditional, we can assume these prophecies are conditional. That's not an argument. That only works for those who already presuppose it to be the case and really want it to be the case, and so are coerced by their dogmatism to think that the argument is adequate. The argument has not yet been adequately made. So there are two reasons that we know the prophecy in Jonah was unconditional. One, no conditions were stated, so it's unconditional.
This is assuming it has to be necessarily stated in a book that's written in a high-context society. When the narrative of...
So I'm just going to tell you that the society was highly contextual, so we can just bake in the assumption that there is a way that that can be successfully argued, but we don't have the adequate evidence for that.
Jonah already spells this out for us, so it doesn't have to be directly stated.
That is why I made haste to flee to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding, steadfast in love, and relenting the disaster. So, I mean, this is like Jonah saying, "Oh God, I knew that you wouldn't do that." So, does Jonah get to dictate God's conditions or what God set forth, or does God get to decide that?
He directly stated.
You're absolutely right. It does not have to be explicitly stated, but it shouldn't be explicitly precluded. And in Jonah, it's explicitly precluded because the text explicitly states that God changed his mind regarding the evil that he had threatened to do to them. You don't change your mind when someone meets conditions you have set, whether those conditions are stated or unstated. If your plan the entire time has been to not do the thing if they meet your conditions, then you are not changing your mind. This is phenomenally basic logic.
Jonah thought God...
Phenomenally basic logic. That's mean, Dan. That's really mean. I would assume that this probably comes in book 4, because that's when Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his robes. This he proclaimed. Let them be... Oh, this is what I was looking for earlier, and I couldn't find it. So this is the king of Nineveh saying, let them give up their evil ways. Who knows? God may yet relent with compassion. So they don't know. I mean, you can make the argument that Jonah knows, but Jonah just declares it or whatever. But again, the king is saying, maybe God will give us compassion. They don't know. They're guessing. They're desperate. If I was going to be destroyed out of desperation, I guess I would try anything too. But yeah, at no point did God say unless they repent.
God was telling him to go give Nineveh an unconditional prophecy, he would have just went so he could watch the city be destroyed, which we see at the end is what he wanted. He would not have fled so that the warning could not be delivered. And this is Strine's point. The book of Jonah just assumes prophecies are conditional. because that was the cultural norm. It didn't necessarily have to be stated every time. People just assumed this was the case.
But that would be an awful misreading of Jonah. It would be like the audience knowing Bruce Willis's character was dead throughout the entire M. Night Shyamalan movie. It would undermine
Spoiler
the
alert.
rhetorical impact of the big reveal, because the tension has been amped up by the audience wondering, why is this idiot so reluctant to go preach destruction to the hated Assyrians? And the great reveal is when Jonah says, I knew you would change your mind. Once again, if someone offers conditions and the people meet the conditions, it is not changing your mind to not impose the penalty threatened if you don't meet the conditions. That's not what it means to change one's mind. In a conditional prophecy, you don't change your mind. You say, I'm going to do X unless you do Y.
And that's exactly what happened. God relented because they did Y. The implication is
He
the
never
prophecy
told them
was
to do
always
it.
thought of as conditional.
No, that's not exactly what happened, because one, God did change their mind. The text is explicit about that. The narrator states, Vayinachem ha'Elohim, God changed his mind. Second, God did not say, unless you do Y. You are insisting that that's the implication. But the fact that the narrator explicitly describes God changing their mind undermines the notion that that is the inference that we should be making there. The text is quite clearly saying God intended to go through with this, but then God's mercy overpowered their intentions. It's not because there were conditions the whole time. There were not. It's because God is merciful and God could not go through with what they intended. This reading is what was intended by the author of Jonah. That was the rhetorical goal of the author of Jonah. The reason you can't accept that is not only because it undermines your argument regarding the Olivet Discourse, but also because you dogmatically opposed the notion that God would change their mind. You can't even pretend to demonstrate that this is true about prophecy. You can only decide that it must be true about prophecy.
No, I can study the evidence from the ancient Near East and the biblical texts to see that prophecies are more often conditional. And then I can infer this is probably
Which your
what an
book did
author
not
is assuming
say.
when he writes a prophecy.
The two problems are, one, no one has ever demonstrated that conditional prophecies outnumber fatalistic prophecies. That's an assumption you've made, that you've asserted, that you've tried to substantiate by cooking up an imaginary quote that does not come from the book you are citing. And two, that inference requires overruling the very words of the author themselves and their rhetorical goals. And your only response there is to argue you're not allowed to bring up rhetorical goals because that's ad hominem. Let's get to the final part of my final engagement with inspiring philosophy. The argument can provide no data.
I'm pretty sure IP did respond to this. I think maybe I watched a little bit of it, but Dan's not going to respond back to it, so.
That demonstrate that all prophecies are conditional unless they explicitly say this cannot be revoked.
But we do give evidence, like appealing to the narrative aspects of the book of Jonah, like I did earlier in this video.
So as I pointed out in part one, this is a misreading of the book of Jonah that entirely undercuts the narrative tension that the author is trying to build that will not be resolved until the great reveal at the beginning of the final chapter of the book. But this is a necessary misreading because the interpretive lens that is being imposed upon Jonah is not concerned for understanding what the author wanted to achieve with their text. The interpretive lens is this prophecy needs to be understood as conditional. How can we negotiate with the text to arrive at the notion that this prophecy was supposed to be understood as conditional? But that's a minority view. That's not the consensus view. The consensus view is precisely what I explained, that this builds narrative tension because the author is not explaining why Jonah would not be excited to go preach destruction to the Ninevites. And just so you know, I'm not making this up. Here's the Hermeneia commentary volume on Jonah from last year by Susan Neidich. Page 35. Jonah's reaction is to run away and refuse his charge without explanation. When the prophet Elijah flees to the mountain, it is to escape Jezebel, who seeks his life. But the reader has no idea why Jonah seeks to escape his charge. In this way, the opening verses set up a major problematic of the book, and encourage the reader to learn more about this odd protagonist and his motivations. And then if we look at the footnote, Robin Payne describes Jonah as a type of anti-prophet. Meyer Sternberg treats Jonah's unexplained reaction to the divine command as exemplifying a surprise gap that controls the reader's progress over a whole book. There is a consensus view of the rhetorical goals of the author of the book of Jonah, and it has to do with building narrative tension because we don't know why Jonah is not preaching destruction to the Ninevites until it is revealed that Jonah knew God would change their mind.
Or appealing to the fact that in Jesus' ministry, he gave conditions that need to be met and even spoke about the possibility of a delay.
And as I pointed out previously, these were all conditions that scholars agree the authors of these texts expected to be met within the time frame they set for the parousia.
Or we could appeal to places like Daniel 4, where Nebuchadnezzar is given what seems like an unconditional prophecy in a dream, but then Daniel tells him to break off your sins by practicing righteousness and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. Even though it's not stated, Daniel just assumes the prophecy can be changed if Nebuchadnezzar repents.
So this is still inadequate evidence, and for at least 3 different reasons. 1, the verse you quoted says that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. This is not Daniel saying, hey, didn't you hear the conditions that were attached? Just meet the conditions and you'll be fine. This is Daniel recognizing that there are no conditions, but saying, hey, repent anyway, and maybe God will change their mind. It's the exact same thing that the king of...
Yeah, it's the maybe thing. Yeah, the king of... what was it?
Nineveh does.
Nineveh, yeah. Yeah, like I pointed out. Oh, Dan's just copying my argument now. Huh.
Only here Nebuchadnezzar doesn't do it, and all of these things happen to Nebuchadnezzar anyway. And that brings up the second thing. It was unconditional because God knew it was going to happen, and it happened. So just pointing out that Daniel says, hey, maybe God will change their mind if you do all these things, doesn't change the fact that this is an unconditional prophecy that still comes to pass according to the narrative. And this brings up the third thing. When you look at all of the prophecies to which you appeal as evidence that prophecies can be conditional even when no conditions are stated, they all share something in common. It is God saying, I'm going to destroy you, and then the people repenting, and then God forgiving them and not destroying them. So there is a specific type of prophecy regarding which God is more likely to change their mind. And it is specifically prophecies about destruction that are averted because the targets of the destruction repent of their wickedness. These are not the defining features of the Olivet Discourse and the prophecy of the Parousia. So the notion that we can transpose the presupposition of conditionality from that specific type of prophecy onto an entirely different type of prophecy is additionally problematized.
And so we keep seeing this cultural norm that most prophecies were understood as conditional.
But you've not demonstrated any such norm. As I pointed out, you are assuming that that is the norm, and then you are inferring that this is how most prophecies would have functioned based on that assumption. You have not remotely made an adequate case for any audience that is not already committed to the list of dogmas that Hayes et al. Lay out in their book. And you're doing it.
Dan's just too good, and it's hard for me to add additional context.
Precisely to resolve a dogmatic problem. You're doing precisely what I said you're doing.
And regardless of motives, this doesn't show I'm wrong. Merely talking about my motives does not address my argument.
I have fully addressed your argument and its inadequacies. I have also addressed your motives to explain why you feel convinced by your inadequate argument. That is for the benefit of others, to show them that apologetic arguments are built on dogmatic presuppositions and cannot get around them. And now we're going to move on to my invitation for you to clarify. So I would like clarification. Are you saying that your argument only works provided everyone involved already accepts a list of Christian dogmas? If that's the case, then your argument can't function within a critical environment. It can only function within a dogmatic environment. If you're making the case that this is a de jure argument that requires presupposing a list of Christian dogmas, please say so. and I will apologize, and I will back out of this argument, and I will be happy to be wrong.
So in one sense, yes, because the critic says, if God is real, how could he have uttered a false prophecy? So to answer that objection, we have to assume God actually did give the prophecy.
So 2 concerns here. The first is that I don't think you've articulated that question adequately. Because if a critic is saying, if God is real, then how could he utter a false prophecy? The presupposition is that the prophecy is false. And the request is that you demonstrate how a real God could utter a false prophecy. That's the situation where they're willing to give you the presupposition that God is real. The request is, prove that a real God can utter a false prophecy. The request there is not, demonstrate that the prophecy isn't false. If they were making that request, it would be something more along the lines of, show that this prophecy is true. And I don't think I've seen a critic make that request while also saying, I'm going to allow you to presuppose a bunch of dogmas along the way. So I don't think that's what the request was. So that's a big concern of mine. Second concern is that if this argument is actually tailor-made, customized to a critic who is offering to presuppose the existence of God, then I want to see the argument that is not customized to that. I want to see the argument that is for a critical environment that is not going to give you any of those presuppositions. I don't think you have anything else to add. I don't think your argument would be any different, because I think your apologetic requires all of these dogmatic presuppositions. But at the same time, I don't think you want to acknowledge that, because if you did acknowledge that, that would be acknowledging that your argument does not work in a critical environment. And as
Yeah, so he'll be slippery and not give that kind of argument, because it's just then he can't peddle the agenda.
And as you're about to argue, you would like for your apologetics to operate in a critical environment. I really don't think it can, but I'm willing to give you one chance to prove me wrong.
But I don't agree it cannot function in a critical environment. And I also don't agree there's a clear distinction between dogmatic and critical environments. I reject the distinction.
Your rejection is noted and also rejected. There's a very clear distinction, and I'll lay it out.
Yeah, I don't. Well, he'll give his. But how could you possibly argue that critical and dogmatic arguments
out for you? In a critical environment, you don't get away with presupposing traditional authorship. You don't get away with presupposing the unity of any given text. You don't get away with presupposing historicity or univocality or inerrancy or inspiration or the existence of a supernatural agent behind the scenes pulling the strings. You have to make a case for all of those things. Now, in a dogmatic environment, you mostly get away with presupposing those things. And if anyone challenges those things, the evidentiary bar that you must clear is phenomenally low. In a critical environment, you have a much higher evidentiary bar to get over. Those things are not presupposed. Now, obviously, the response is going to be the standard apologetic retreat to epistemological uncertainty so that you can say, aha, but critical scholars also have presuppositions. Yes, critical scholars must presuppose certain things to cover gaps in epistemological uncertainty so that we can arrive at conclusions. But those are always based on theoretical and methodological frameworks that are only provisionally accepted, unless and until an argument comes forth that shows they are inadequate or that there is a better theoretical or methodological framework. That's the difference. In a critical environment, everything is open to scrutiny and to revision and to replacement. In a dogmatic environment, there is a list of things that are not open to scrutiny, to revision, or to replacement. And that is why your argument cannot operate in a critical environment.
And so I'm not going to agree with the claim that we're just doing this to save dogma. I think we do have good reasons and evidence to suggest this is a plausible and parsimonious reading of the text.
So this is the standard apologetic approach, and it's another wonderful illustration of the distinction between a critical environment and a dogmatic environment. Because in a critical environment, scholars are primarily concerned for identifying the most likely conclusion, whatever that may be. In a dogmatic environment, your conclusion is already presupposed, and the job is to try to construct the most convincing argument that presupposed conclusion is not impossible.
Yeah, I was going to say that. They don't go for what does the evidence say? They just go for, well, is there no contradiction? Just because there's no contradiction doesn't mean that it did happen, that it's likely to have happened, or that it could have happened given the conditions or whatever.
Or maybe even that it's plausible. That's how it usually gets framed. And this is why you will generally argue that you have good reason to believe that something is plausible. That always seems to be the line that you retreat to. And I think it's because you recognize that you're not making the case that your position is the most likely position.
He does that same thing with, he has this video, or I've seen him do videos on the Exodus IP, that is, where he says like, well, less than 1% of Egypt has been excavated. So the fact that we don't have any evidence of Israelites living in Egypt or of the Exodus is absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It's like, I mean, okay, but of the millions of artifacts and tens of thousands of bodies that we have, like the idea that we could have, in a random sample like that, we'd come up with zilch, if there actually were hundreds of thousands of Israelites there, seems just completely untenable.
You're just trying to make the case to your audience that their belief is not impossible. Because if you can gin up the tiniest little sliver of not impossible, then everybody who already agrees with the presupposed conclusion can feel justified in agreeing with it.
So even though this is presented to us as an internal critique, we're not just arguing this way to save dogma.
Yes, you are. And the fit for this video,
The end.
has been Dipper Pines.
Good old Dan.